The first time I saw a face staring back at me from the other side of the glass, I thought it was just my reflection. It wasn't. Down here 3 miles beneath the surface, light bends in strange ways, and so does reality. The Oceanus 9 station runs on one simple system of survival. 11 rules that keep us from losing our minds. Or worse. I used to think they were just superstitions, a list of weird traditions left by the last crew. But I learned the truth when I broke one. I still don't know what I saw that night, only that it wanted me to look closer, and I almost did. They told me about Rule 1, never look through the glass after midnight on my first night at Oceanus 9, but no one explained why. I remember laughing when the technician handed me the laminated list, thinking it was just another psychological trick for newcomers. Down here, surrounded by endless black water, your mind starts inventing things to keep itself busy. But that first night, as the base lights dimmed and the corridors fell silent, I realized there was something different about the glass. It didn't reflect like it should. It seemed to breathe, almost ripple, as if the ocean outside was pressing against it with intent. The observation deck was my favorite spot. It wrapped around the front of the main lab, a half dome of reinforced glass facing the abyss. When I stood there alone, I could see my faint reflection over the faint glow of bioluminescent plankton drifting past. The hum of the air filters, the soft vibration of the generator below, it all felt strangely alive. That's when I first noticed the flicker of movement outside, just at the edge of the floodlight's reach. It wasn't fish, it was slower, deliberate. My instinct told me to step closer, to focus, but then I remembered the rule and forced myself to look away. Still, curiosity gnawed at me. Midnight came and went, and the longer I ignored the pull to the glass, the heavier the air felt in my lungs. My shift partner, Lewis, laughed it off, saying these rules were made by the first crew after one of them cracked under pressure, literally and mentally. They used to hear voices in the water, he said, grinning while sipping his instant coffee. One guy even swore he saw his dead brother looking back at him from the viewport. I didn't laugh. There was something about the way the glass shimmered that made me uneasy, like it was aware of me watching. The next day passed in a blur of routine, collecting samples, logging temperatures, running salinity tests. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something outside the window had noticed me. Every time I walked past the glass, I caught a glimpse of movement just beyond the visibility line. When I tried to adjust the external cameras, the feed showed static. The station's AI flagged the sensors as operational, but no data was coming through from the west side of the dome. I told Lewis about it. He shrugged and said the ocean likes to play tricks on people who stare too long. I didn't tell him that the reflection in the glass had started lagging a second behind my movements. By the third night, sleep felt impossible. The rhythmic hum of the station usually lulled everyone into dreamless rest, but I kept waking up, convinced I heard faint tapping somewhere near my cabin wall. The sound wasn't mechanical, not part of the base systems. It was softer, almost hesitant, like something brushing against the metal hull. I tried to focus on breathing, counting the seconds between the sounds, but each time I opened my eyes, I swore I saw shadows drifting past the porthole. I wanted to believe it was just plankton or debris stirred up by the current, but then I realized the ocean was completely still. At 11:56 p.m., I sat on the edge of my bunk, heart pounding, staring at the digital clock, glowing red in the darkness. The deck outside my cabin was only a short walk away. I told myself I just needed to confirm there was nothing out there to stop my mind from spiraling. The corridors were empty, the emergency lights casting everything in a dull amber hue. As I reached the observation deck, the silence pressed in so thick I could hear my heartbeat echo through my suit. I hesitated at the door. The glass loomed ahead, that massive curve of darkness beyond it whispering with the soft groan of the sea. It was 12:01 a.m. when I finally stepped inside. The deck lights dimmed automatically, leaving only the faint illumination from the external floods. I approached the glass slowly, my reflection merging with the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing, just my own pale face, tired eyes, the faint tremor in my hand. Then the light outside flickered, and something moved. A pale shape, distant but distinct, drifting closer like a figure suspended in the water. My breath fogged the glass. I leaned forward, squinting, my rational mind screaming that it was just a trick of the current. But then the shape stopped moving. It hovered directly in front of me, and I realized it was mimicking my breathing. My pulse thundered. I took a step back, and so did it. I turned my head slightly, and it mirrored me again perfectly, but with a delay, a second too slow, like the ocean itself was learning to imitate me. The lights flickered once more, and for the briefest instant, the reflection didn't match me at all. Its mouth opened wide, and something like a ripple passed through its face. I stumbled backward, my heel catching on the grated floor, and that's when the emergency siren blared through the station. Lewis's voice came through the intercom, panicked, shouting that the pressure readings were spiking on the outer hull. I sprinted toward the control panel, slamming the hatch closed behind me as the alarms echoed through the station. The sensors showed nothing outside the deck, no breaches, no structural stress, but the readings were fluctuating wildly, as if something enormous was pressing against the glass. Then suddenly, everything stopped. The alarms went silent. The pressure normalized. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, listening to the silence return like a held breath finally released. Lewis burst into the room, moments later, demanding to know what happened. I told him I didn't know, that I hadn't touched anything. I lied. I didn't tell him I'd broken the first rule. He looked at me for a long moment, then walked over to the viewport, squinting into the darkness. "You didn't look, did you?" he asked quietly. His tone wasn't mocking this time, it was frightened. I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could, the external lights flickered again, and for a split second, the glass seemed to pulse inward, like a heartbeat beneath the ocean. Lewis stepped back, muttering under his breath, and reached for the intercom to call command. The line crackled, distorted, and through the static, a voice came through, not his, not mine, but something that sounded like both. I didn't sleep that night, neither did Lewis. We stayed in the common room, lights on, pretending to work through data logs while avoiding the direction of the deck. Every so often, the lights dimmed for just a moment longer than they should have, and the glass made that soft, almost imperceptible sound, the sound of something shifting its weight outside. When the morning rotation arrived, we said nothing about it. We just checked the oxygen levels, recalibrated the sensors, and kept our eyes away from the observation dome. But I couldn't shake the feeling that when I turned my back, the reflection was still there, waiting for me to look again. That night, Command sent us new orders, routine maintenance on the exterior floodlights. Someone had to go out in the submersible to inspect the outer casing. Lewis volunteered before I could speak. He smiled at me, like everything was fine, but I saw the fear in his eyes. When he descended, the radio connection flickered. Static filled the channel. For a while I heard nothing. Then his voice came through, faint and hollow. "There's something on the glass," he whispered. "It's looking at me," and then the feed went dead. When Lewis's voice vanished from the comms, my first instinct was to call control. But the uplink was dead too. The ocean had swallowed the signal, leaving only the quiet hum of the station and the faint echo of my own breathing. I stared at the console, the blinking red indicator of the lost connection burning into my mind. That's when I remembered Rule 2. Never go outside alone, no matter the reason. Lewis had joked about it earlier in the week, said it was probably meant to prevent accidents during solo dives. But hearing his last words, "It's looking at me," made the rule feel less like a guideline and more like a warning left behind by someone who didn't survive to explain it. I waited for him to come back. Every minute that passed stretched into an hour. The submersible's tracker light still pulsed on the radar, fixed in the same spot, about 100 meters from the observation dome. I tried to re-establish communication, but the system only returned static. The thought of going out there gnawed at me. I knew procedure demanded a retrieval if contact was lost, but another part of me couldn't move. I kept thinking of the reflection, the mimic in the glass, and how it might not have been confined to the other side anymore. The pressure outside pressed on the walls, and the metal groaned like the station itself was holding its breath. When command finally came online, their voices were scrambled and distant. They told me to hold position and wait for daylight cycle before attempting any recovery. Daylight didn't mean much down here, just a shift in the floodlight's intensity. But the psychological illusion helped. I shut down the external arrays and tried to focus on the hum of the filtration system, pretending the rhythmic pulse was Lewis breathing somewhere nearby. But when I checked the camera feeds again, one of the external lights had gone out. The darkness on that section of the dome looked deeper than black, like something was absorbing the light rather than blocking it. At 0300 hours, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed my dive suit from the locker, ignoring the tremor in my hands. The oxygen tank hissed softly as I sealed it into place. My mind screamed that I was breaking protocol, but another voice, quieter, almost patient, whispered that I couldn't leave him out there. I kept thinking of how he smiled before leaving, how sure he was that everything was fine. The suit's comms buzzed faintly as I ran diagnostics. Everything checked out, though I noticed the pressure calibration had shifted slightly, an impossible reading. The ocean outside was growing heavier. I cycled through the airlock slowly, each mechanical hiss echoing like a heartbeat. The inner hatch sealed behind me, and I felt the weight of the sea pressing in before the outer door opened. Cold blue darkness rushed into view, filled with drifting particles like falling dust. I stepped out, the floodlights painting long cones through the black. The silence was suffocating. Even the hum of my breathing unit seemed distant, muffled, as if the water itself was listening. The submersible's beacon still blinked faintly ahead, a small red pulse in the endless dark. I moved toward it, the tether line coiling behind me like a thin silver thread. The seafloor was uneven, scattered with sediment and fragments of coral that looked like bones under the artificial light. Each step stirred clouds of silt that hung in the water, obscuring my view. I tried calling out over the radio again. "Lewis, respond if you can hear me." Nothing, just a low crackle of interference. I increased my pace, heart pounding. The red light grew brighter, and soon the outline of the sub came into view, its front window cracked, the interior dark. My breath caught in my throat. I tapped the external hull with my gloved hand, half hoping he'd answer. No response. The pilot's seat was empty. For a long moment, I just floated there, suspended in disbelief. The glass of the sub reflected my helmet light back at me, but as I shifted, I saw something else in that reflection. Movement. Slow, deliberate. Behind me, I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. The water was calm, the sediment still drifting lazily. I told myself it was a trick of the light, just like before, but then I noticed something strange. My tether line wasn't taut anymore. It was moving, gently coiling, as if something unseen was sliding a finger along it. My lungs tightened. I followed it back with my light, but halfway between me and the airlock, the line disappeared into a thick shadow. I started backing toward the sub, scanning the darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to return, but I couldn't see the path clearly. The silt had clouded everything. Then out of nowhere a shape drifted into view. It was human, or at least it looked that way at first. The suit was like ours, but older, covered in algae and small shell growths, the glass of the helmet opaque and cracked. It hovered just above the seafloor, motionless. My throat went dry. "Lewis," I whispered, knowing full well it wasn't him. The figure didn't move. I raised my hand slowly, my light catching its faceplate, and that's when it turned. The motion was wrong. Too fluid, too slow. Inside the cracked helmet, something shifted, pressing against the glass from within, like a hand or a face, trying to emerge. I kicked backward, my fins scraping the sediment. The thing started drifting closer, its body swaying as though carried by a current that didn't exist. My radio crackled suddenly, and a voice came through, faint but unmistakable. "Don't look at it," it said. It was Lewis's voice. "Don't let it see your face." I froze. The figure stopped moving, then began to tilt its head in time with mine. The delay was back, just like the reflection in the glass. I turned and bolted for the airlock, every muscle screaming. The tether line jerked violently once, then went slack. I didn't dare look back. My oxygen levels spiked from panic, and the sound of my breathing drowned everything else. When the airlock finally came into view, I slammed the release button, forcing the hatch to cycle faster than it was meant to. The pressure equalized with a groan, and the door slid shut just as something heavy struck it from the other side. The whole station shuddered, lights flickering, dust raining from the ceiling panels. I collapsed against the inner hatch, shaking uncontrollably. When I peeled the helmet off, the air tasted metallic. The lights flickered one last time before stabilizing, and then the emergency systems kicked in. I checked the monitors. The sub's beacon was gone. No signal, no trace. Lewis had vanished completely, and whatever was out there was still pressing against the glass. I didn't need to look to know it was there. I could feel it. Every camera facing the ocean was static now, every feed corrupted. Command signal was dead, again. I sat in the dim light of the control room, soaked in sweat, staring at my own reflection in the monitor. It blinked when I didn't. Hours passed before I moved. I logged the incident, every detail, though part of me knew it didn't matter. No one would believe it. The deeper truth settled into my chest like cold lead. Lewis had broken the second rule, and I'd nearly followed him. Whatever was outside didn't need to come in. It just needed to be seen. That thought stayed with me as I sealed off the lower decks and shut down the observation systems completely. But in the silence that followed, I still heard the faint vibration through the hull. It was rhythmic, measured, like someone or something walking just outside the station. I turned off the lights to see if the noise would stop. It didn't. Instead, faint blue shapes began to appear beyond the glass, drifting closer, slow as ghosts. I didn't look directly at them, but I could feel their presence, the temperature in the room dropping with each passing second. One of them pressed a hand, or what looked like one, against the viewport. The outline was faint, distorted by the curvature of the glass. For a brief, terrible moment, I thought I saw the shape of Lewis's face behind it, pale and distorted by the water. Then it was gone. That was the last time I tried to contact anyone topside. I sealed every access panel, locked every control. The ocean outside had grown too still, too aware. I thought I was safe inside the station, surrounded by steel and pressure, but I was wrong. Because when I walked past the viewport later that night, something new appeared in my reflection, something standing right behind me where no one should have been. I barely slept after what happened to Lewis. The station felt emptier, like a living thing that had lost its heartbeat. Every corridor hummed with tension. Every flicker of light felt like a breath being held. I tried convincing myself I was alone down here, that whatever was outside had left with him. But then came Rule 3. If you hear someone calling your name from the water, don't answer. It was printed halfway down the laminated list, underlined twice in red ink, as if whoever wrote it wanted to make sure it could never be ignored. At the time, I didn't think much of it, until the night the ocean spoke back. The following days were uneventful on the surface. Systems remained stable, and the pressure levels outside normalized. I sent daily reports, but command never responded. Either the signal couldn't reach them, or they'd stopped trying to reach me. I focused on routine cleaning filters, running diagnostics, monitoring oxygen levels, anything to keep my mind from wandering toward the black glass of the observation deck. But even during the day cycle, the silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. The ocean was too still. Normally, the hum of currents or distant whale song filled the hydrophones with soft noise. Now there was nothing, only the occasional pop of thermal expansion echoing through the metal. By the 5th day, the quiet started playing tricks on me. I began hearing faint noises that didn't belong. Soft drips, murmurs, whispers I couldn't quite place. At first I thought it was the pipe shifting or the vents releasing pressure. But one evening, while reviewing the audio logs, I caught something unmistakable. A voice. My name. It was faint, distorted, like someone speaking through layers of water. Daniel, it said. Just once, then silence. I froze, replaying the segment, but the sound was gone. Static filled the rest of the recording. I deleted the file, telling myself it was interference, an overlap from older transmissions. But deep down I knew it wasn't. The voice came again 2 nights later. I was in the mess hall, halfway through a cold packet of rations, when I heard it clearly, closer this time, coming from the air vent above my head. Daniel. It was soft, almost gentle, and for a split second, I could have sworn it was Lewis. I stood slowly, staring at the vent, the sound vibrating faintly through the metal. Lewis, I whispered. The air stopped moving. The sound died instantly. I stood there for several minutes, listening to the thrum of the generators. Nothing else came. I sat back down, my pulse hammering in my ears, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. But when I turned my head, I caught a faint reflection in the microwave door, someone standing just behind me. I spun around. No one was there. The corridor leading out of the mess hall was empty, lit only by the emergency strips. The reflection had vanished, but the faint chill in the air remained. I left the tray where it was, and hurried back to the control room. The lights flickered once as I entered, then steadied. I checked the exterior cameras again, still static. No movement, no readings. I wanted to believe everything was fine, that isolation was warping my senses, but then the comms light blinked on its own. A transmission request. My hands shook as I accepted it. Lewis, I asked. The line crackled, and a voice came through, whispering my name again, clearer now, dragging out each syllable like it was savoring them. My skin went cold. Who is this? I demanded. No reply, just breathing, wet, uneven, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of water. The signal cut abruptly, replaced by a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floor. I pulled the headset off, my heartbeat deafening in the silence. I knew I should have logged the event, but I couldn't bring myself to write it down. Words made things real, and this, whatever it was, needed to stay unreal. That night, I left every light on, every monitor glowing, but as I tried to rest, I swore I could hear faint knocking through the hull again. This time, it came in slow, deliberate intervals. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. The next morning, I found water pooling near the airlock door. Just a thin layer, barely enough to notice, but the source didn't make sense. The seals were intact. The sensors showed no breach. I followed the trail with a flashlight, and it led straight to the viewing dome. The glass was dry, spotless, yet when I knelt to inspect the floor, I heard it again. Daniel, louder now, echoing faintly through the metal beneath my feet. I stumbled back, eyes fixed on the glass. The ocean outside was darker than usual, as if the floodlights were dimming of their own accord. Then slowly, I saw a shape moving beyond the glass. It was humanoid, tall, pale, its movements impossibly smooth. It hovered just beyond the light's reach, watching. I couldn't see its face clearly, but when it shifted closer, I realized why. The features were wrong. They were too soft, too fluid, as if the water itself was forming a face and trying to hold it together. Then the mouth opened, and the sound that came out was mine. My own voice, calling my name. Daniel. The word rolled through the glass like a heartbeat, and for a second, my body moved on its own. I almost answered. I caught myself, pressing a hand to my mouth. The rule screamed in my mind, like an alarm. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the comms room. The signal lights were flickering again, multiple incoming frequencies blinking at once. My screen filled with repeating messages, each one a short, looping audio clip. I hit play on one. It was my own voice, recorded perfectly, whispering from somewhere deep underwater. "Let me in." I ripped the headphones off, shoving the chair away from the desk. Every monitor now showed the same static feed, but if I looked closely, I could see faint outlines forming behind it, silhouettes pressing against the other side of the screens. I cut power to the entire deck. The lights died instantly, plunging the room into shadow. That's when I heard it again, not from the speakers this time, from the vent above. "Daniel." The voice was softer now, almost pleading. "Please, it's cold." I froze where I stood. My throat tightened, my chest constricting with panic. I knew that tone. It was Lewis's voice, perfectly familiar, perfectly wrong. "You left me," it said, words bubbling like breath underwater. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Instead I whispered, "You're not him." The voice paused, then something heavy dragged across the ceiling, metal bending with the weight of it. When it spoke again, it didn't sound like anyone human. The sound that followed was low, guttural, vibrating through the walls, like an echo trapped inside the station itself. I stumbled backward, until my shoulder hit the control panel. The emergency lights flickered, and for a split second, I saw a shadow dart past the window. My name echoed once more, clear, sharp, right behind my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. Only the hum of the dying power systems filled the room. I hit the breaker to restore power, and as the lights came back, the monitors flickered with one final image. The observation dome, with a single pale hand pressed against the glass from the outside. I sealed the vents that night, bolting every access hatch shut, but even now, the voice hasn't stopped. It changes tone sometimes, male, female, even sounding like my own mother once. Always calm, always coaxing, always asking the same thing. "Why won't you answer me?" I keep reminding myself that it isn't real, that it's part of whatever phenomenon claimed Lewis. But sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I hear it whisper from right beside my bed, soft as a sigh. And in those moments, I almost forget why I shouldn't respond. After that night with the voice, I became obsessive about everything I touched. Every switch, every lever, every digital pad. I treated them like they were alive, and maybe they were. That's when I remembered Rule 4. Never touch the control panels with wet hands. At the time, it had seemed like a mundane precaution, some minor safety guideline meant to prevent shorts in the system. Now I knew it was more than that. A single careless touch could invite something into the station, and with the way the water outside pressed against the hull, I wasn't willing to risk it. My gloves stayed dry, my hands scrubbed every hour, and every action was slow, deliberate, like walking through a minefield. The first sign that the rule was vital came the next morning. I had just finished logging the external pressure readings when a thin film of condensation gathered on the main console. My gloves had slipped slightly while adjusting the data pad, and the faintest smear of moisture made me freeze. The screen flickered once, then shifted on its own. The cursor jumped across the readouts, as if guided by a phantom hand. I yanked my fingers back and slammed the emergency power override. The monitors blinked, trying to return to normal, but one feed refused to reset. It showed the observation dome, and there, beyond the glass, I could see movement in the shadows. Not human, too tall, too thin, and the way it glided made the water itself seem warped. I called command again, but the transmission failed instantly. It was always like this now. The deeper the ocean pressed against the station, the more it seemed to absorb all signals, leaving me alone with the unblinking eyes in the water. Every time I glanced at the viewport, I saw traces of shapes moving at the periphery. They mimicked the station's movements sometimes, like it was learning the rhythm of our lives. I tried not to think about what might happen if those shadows crossed the glass entirely. Every time I imagined it, I felt my own reflection shift unnaturally, as though the line between me and whatever was out there was growing thinner. That afternoon, a sudden surge of moisture appeared across the hallway lights. They flickered violently, and I nearly dropped the datapad while trying to stabilize them. The station's internal sensors registered nothing unusual. No leaks, no faults, yet the condensation continued to spread, trailing from vent to vent, dripping down walls. I moved cautiously, gloved hands barely grazing the panels. Every drop of water that touched the console made the screen stutter, numbers jumping, graphs twisting into impossible shapes. I could almost feel a presence leaning into each key press, waiting for me to slip up. My breath caught, and I realized the rule wasn't just for electrical safety. It was a boundary. Touch it wrong, and the ocean might step inside. By the 5th day after Lewis vanished, I barely ventured near the observation deck. The lights outside the glass were now dim, casting everything in shadowy blue. But the pressure readings indicated something large was pressing against the station hull intermittently. I didn't need to see it to feel it, and when I did need to adjust the external floodlights, I had to plan every motion carefully. Wet gloves were forbidden. Wet hands could be fatal. I remembered how small mistakes had led to Lewis's disappearance, and the voice from the water echoed in my memory, soft but insistent, warning me of the same dangers. Even brushing against the console too hard made me flinch, like a predator was lurking just beneath the plastic and steel. One night, I tried to override the environmental controls. The station temperature had dropped several degrees, chilling the air inside. I kept my hands dry, gloves layered, but a sudden leak from the upper deck sent a thin stream of water down the panel edge. The monitors blinked rapidly, lights flashing in chaotic sequences. And then I heard it, a low guttural sound that vibrated through the hull. Not the mimic voice, not Lewis, but something different, something massive, moving just outside the station. I couldn't see it, but the water against the glass rippled like a hand brushing along the exterior, slow and deliberate. My fingers tensed, ready to pull back at the slightest hint of contact, and the console stuttered with every heartbeat I held. The figure beyond the glass became bolder. As the week passed, it moved in sync with my own actions, stopping when I stopped, tilting its head when I tilted mine. I began experimenting with small motions, barely touching the panels, adjusting the lights in the hallways. Every flick of a switch made the shadow drift closer. The station systems were starting to behave as though they had a will of their own, subtly influencing the feedback loops, guiding my actions, shaping my responses. It was terrifying and fascinating all at once. And then the wet patch on the console grew into a thin stream that slithered across the keys on its own. I swear I saw the reflection of a face in the water droplet, a pale, impossible shape staring back at me. That night, the external floodlights failed completely. The observation dome was nothing but a black void, and I had no choice but to monitor the hull sensors manually. I adjusted each reading carefully, tapping only the dry parts of the panels, gloves squeaking against the metal. The hum of the station became louder, almost unbearable, a constant reminder that the ocean outside was waiting. And then the voice came again, low, guttural, layered beneath the mechanical hiss of the systems. It wasn't Lewis, but it mimicked him, calling me closer, encouraging me to touch, to adjust, to open the wrong hatch. My pulse raced. I clenched my gloves into fists and forced myself to ignore it. In the middle of the night, I heard a dragging sound through the main corridor. I froze. The station had no maintenance bots operating at that hour, and nothing should have been moving. The hum of the generators masked the faint vibration in the floor, but I could feel it, uneven, deliberate. My gloved hands gripped the nearest console edge for support, careful to keep dry. The reflection of my own hands trembled in the monitor, but somewhere behind me, the shadow mirrored my every movement. I realized that touching the panels with wet hands wasn't just a rule, it was a protection, a barrier against whatever was learning how to manipulate our station from outside. By dawn, I was exhausted, constantly on edge, barely moving except when absolutely necessary. The external floodlights flickered back on, weakly illuminating the water beyond. I watched the shadows glide just beyond their reach, hovering at the edge of visibility. One of them lingered directly outside the observation dome, elongated and silent, motionless in a way that made the water seem unnatural. I thought about the first rule, the second, and the third, the chain of warnings the station demanded I follow. Every one led to this, to the fragile safety provided by keeping my hands dry and my mind sharp. A single lapse, a single touch in the wrong place, and the consequences would be immediate. Later that day, I found an old maintenance log from the first crew. The notes were sparse but desperate, warnings scrawled in the margins about moisture and static, about lights failing and voices calling names from the water. The word wet appeared more than once, underlined heavily. I understood then why the rule existed. The ocean outside was more than water. It was aware, it responded, and it could reach inside, through the smallest of vulnerabilities. Rule 4 was not merely about safety. It was a shield. I didn't need to test it. I knew if I broke it, the shadows would cross the glass and the station would become a tomb. Even now, every time condensation forms, every time a leak drips down the panels, I flinch. My gloves stay layered. My eyes avoid unnecessary movement near the consoles. The airlock system and floodlights get the barest adjustments, nothing more, because touching the control panels with wet hands isn't just a guideline, it's a lifeline. One mistake, and the ocean's shadow could reach in, one touch at a time, and I would never see daylight again. After weeks of isolation and constant vigilance, I learned the value of the simplest precautions. Rule 5, always keep the emergency lights on during sleep cycles, had once seemed trivial, a minor guideline for comfort or redundancy. Now it was a lifeline. The shadows beyond the glass were patient, relentless, and they learned quickly. Darkness was their ally. I kept the strip lights dim but constant, the soft amber glow cutting across the floor, hallways, and observation deck. Sleep became a strategic act, short, vigilant naps, never fully surrendering to unconsciousness, because I knew the moment the lights died, I was exposed to whatever pressed against the hull. That first night I tried to ignore the rule, curiosity gnawing at me. I switched off the emergency lights in the control room for a few minutes, wanting silence and darkness, thinking perhaps the shadows couldn't see me fully through the glass. I barely made it through 10 minutes. The temperature seemed to drop instantly, cold curling into my spine like icy fingers. Shapes began to coalesce beyond the observation dome, pale, tall, gliding just at the edges of visibility. The darkness brought them closer, bold, almost confident. Panic struck me as I flipped the switches back on. The glow returned, and the shapes retreated, dissolving into the blue of the deep ocean. That was when I understood the deadly importance of this rule. The next nights became a test of endurance. My sleep cycles shortened, a constant battle between exhaustion and survival. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the subtle pressure shifts outside, faint brushing against the hull, as if the water itself was inching forward. I left the lights on at a dim, continuous level, illuminating the hallways, just enough to see, but not too bright to cast reflections onto the glass. The mimicry, the shadows and the voices, they all paused when the light stayed constant. But every blink, every accidental dip in power, made me question whether the shadows were learning patterns, timing, and habits. One particularly long night, a strong current outside caused the observation dome's outer floodlights to flicker. I rushed to the emergency panel to stabilize the backup strips. My hands moved deliberately, gloved and careful, but the shadows beyond the glass paused mid-motion, watching. For the first time I realized they were intelligent, calculating. The momentary dark spots invited them closer, and the slightest hesitation on my part made me feel like I was already trespassing into their domain. I had to remind myself, even in my own fear, that the lights weren't just illumination, they were a protective wall. The psychological strain grew heavier. I started dreaming with my eyes open, hallucinating movements in the glow of the emergency lights. Faces, pale, distorted, unhuman, pressed against the glass from the outside, lingering for only seconds before vanishing. Each time I snapped awake to ensure the lights hadn't failed. The mere act of blinking felt dangerous. Every sound in the station, every groan of metal, every drip of water became a potential prelude to their approach. The ocean wasn't just a background anymore. It was a sentient presence, observing my habits, testing my endurance, measuring how long I could maintain vigilance before mistakes began. One night the lights flickered uncontrollably, a rapid strobe that left the station partially illuminated. My heart raced as I realized the main power feed had failed temporarily. The shadows beyond the glass swarmed instantly, moving in ways they hadn't before, fast, fluid, closer. I barely made it to the backup panel, resetting the circuit. The glow returned, but the terror didn't fade. They hovered near the surface of visibility, waiting, patient, as if daring me to rest. I knew I couldn't risk even a second of darkness. The rule wasn't arbitrary, it was literal survival. The hours of constant vigilance began to blur. Exhaustion became my permanent companion. I learned to sleep sitting upright, the emergency lights dim but steady, a thin line of amber cutting through the dark corners of the station. The water outside became a constant, omnipresent threat. Shadows pressed against the hull, and the faint murmur of voices seeped through vents and cracks, a combination of past crew echoes and mimicry, warning and taunting at the same time. Each night the voices grew bolder, calling my name from every corner of the station. I didn't answer. I never answered. During one particularly tense cycle, I thought I glimpsed movement inside the station itself. My monitor feeds were all stable, nothing unusual, yet a shadow flitted across the wall of the corridor beyond the control room. I froze. The lights were steady, full, constant. It couldn't exist in the illuminated space. Still, I backed away slowly, maintaining line of sight with the emergency glow. The feeling was uncanny, like I wasn't alone inside the station anymore, like the shadows had learned to infiltrate the interior when darkness allowed. My pulse pounded, but I didn't move any closer, didn't touch anything else, didn't blink long enough to break the line of light. Every morning I would inspect the station for new traces of water or pressure disturbances. Minor leaks seemed normal, minor system glitches accounted for, but everything else was intentional. The shadows weren't random, they were calculating, learning, testing the limits of their containment, and I was teaching them every time I fell asleep, every time I closed my eyes, every time I allowed the lights to dim below the minimum required level. That was the deadly truth about Rule 5. Survival required constant, obsessive awareness, an endless struggle to maintain illumination as a shield. One evening, I experimented slightly, adjusting the intensity of the lights in small increments to see how far the shadows would advance. The reaction was immediate. The shapes beyond the glass twitched, distorted, almost like muscles flexing under skin, then receded as I increased the glow. I realized then that the ocean wasn't passive, it was sentient, studying me, interacting with my actions, pushing and pulling, always testing. The lights weren't just protection, they were negotiation, a boundary that had to be respected. Any lapse invited intrusion. By now my body was worn down, muscles stiff, eyelids heavy, but I never let them fully close. The station systems became my lifeline, the emergency lights my guardian. I slept upright in the control room chair, eyes open, headset ready, lights steady. Every movement beyond the glow was a threat. Every drip, every shadow, every whisper was an active danger. I repeated the rule silently, over and over, a mantra against fatigue. Always keep the emergency lights on during sleep cycles. The shadows had grown cunning, but the lights gave me a boundary, a line they could not cross without revealing themselves. Even now, months later, the knowledge of Rule 5 is ingrained in every action I take. No matter how exhausted, no matter how desperate for real sleep, the lights remain on. The shadows press against the hull, waiting, patient, learning, and I wait with them, vigilant, knowing that darkness is not just a void, it is a predator, a mirror of the ocean's intelligence, and one moment of negligence could end me as it ended Lois. The lights are my lifeline, the thin thread separating my sanity from the abyss. Without them, I am already lost. The first time I saw the spikes on the pressure sensors, I froze. I should have known better. Remembered immediately. Rule 6. Never ignore unusual pressure readings in the hull. But I thought maybe it was a system glitch, a minor fluctuation, like the station occasionally recorded. I didn't realize how serious it was until the metal beneath my feet groaned in response. It wasn't the normal hum of currents or the soft thrum of the generators. It was deliberate, uneven, a heavy vibration that seemed to move across the station's frame, like something enormous brushing against the outer hull. I realized then that ignoring the data wasn't an option. It was a death sentence. I rushed to the observation deck, my gloves squeaking as I adjusted the monitors, trying to compare the sensors to previous days. The readings were fluctuating wildly, far beyond anything the station had experienced in months of operation. At first, the spikes were small, subtle, easily dismissed, but each minute made them more pronounced. The ocean outside pressed against the glass, and I could see faint, impossible distortions along the surface. Shapes moved just beyond the floodlights, slower than currents, deliberate, synchronized with the pressure spikes. The station groaned again, and my stomach dropped. Ignoring this was no longer an option. I needed to act. I called command, but the line was dead, just as it had been for weeks. I tried multiple channels, repeated frequencies, even the emergency beacon, but nothing cut through. The ocean seemed to have swallowed all connections. I was alone, left with the readings and the ominous presence outside. Every fluctuation in the sensors coincided with movement just beyond the viewport. Shadows stretched along the floor of the deep, pale arms or tentacles, gliding in ways water shouldn't allow. I double-checked my calibrations, triple-checked the instruments. Everything was functioning normally. The anomaly wasn't in the instruments. It was out there. I spent hours mapping the spikes, trying to find a pattern. They weren't random. Peaks and valleys appeared at intervals too deliberate for natural causes, each spike corresponding to a movement along the hull. I realized with mounting horror that whatever was outside could exert pressure on the station at will. My heart raced as I calculated. If the pressure continued to spike, I could lose the integrity of the hull. If that happened, there would be no returning to the observation deck, no escaping the shadows pressing against the glass. Ignoring the warning had already proven dangerous. Now it was a matter of survival. The first real test came when I tried to stabilize the internal pressure manually. I adjusted valves slowly, meticulously, my gloves dry but slick with sweat. The readings responded, but only temporarily. Every minor correction triggered another spike somewhere else, almost as if the station itself were being toyed with. I realized that the entity outside wasn't just observing, it was learning. Every attempt to correct the pressure seemed to teach it, guiding the shadow's movements in ways I couldn't predict. I felt trapped in a game I didn't understand, the rules of which were written in metal and water and fear. At one point the spike became extreme. The glass of the observation dome rippled inward slightly, a faint bend I hadn't noticed before. I recoiled, gloved hands pressing against the console. My mind raced. This was beyond anything recorded in the manuals or prior logs. If the pressure breached the tolerance, the entire lower deck could implode. I knew I had to act fast, to manage the system without allowing panic to dictate my movements. Every tap, every rotation of a dial, every adjustment to a valve felt like walking a razor's edge. The shadow outside seemed to hover, watching, waiting, responding. The next few hours were a blur of calculation and fear. I monitored multiple sensors simultaneously, cross-referencing hull integrity with external pressures, running emergency protocols I had only practiced once during simulations. Each spike coincided with small but impossible movements outside the floodlights, shapes that elongated and contorted, defying physics, hovering unnaturally close to the glass. My pulse matched the rhythm of the spikes, adrenaline burning through my veins as I tried to maintain the fragile balance that kept the station intact. One misstep, one ignored reading, and everything would collapse. The entity, or entities, outside seemed to grow bolder as the night progressed. When I glanced at the viewport, I caught a flicker of something moving against the far edge of the dome, just beyond the range of light. It mimicked my own posture, mirrored my movements with a second's delay. I shivered, remembering Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 3, and Rule 5, the chain of rules all interconnected, leading to this critical moment. Ignoring the spikes wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. The ocean's shadow was waiting for any sign of weakness, and if I faltered even for a second, it would exploit it immediately. By dawn, I had recalibrated the entire hull monitoring system, isolating sections, applying pressure compensations incrementally. The spikes slowed, diminished, but the shadows lingered, pressing against the glass, patient, observing. I could see details now, the elongated fingers of some unnatural limb, pressing faintly against the reinforced steel. Movement outside aligned perfectly with fluctuations inside, confirming what I had feared. It could feel the station, anticipate changes, and react with intelligence. The ocean wasn't passive, it was aware. That day, I scoured the historical logs for past anomalies, for any clue as to how prior crews had survived. Every entry, every note, every scribbled warning emphasized the same point. Hull pressure readings were the first line of defense. Early spikes were warnings, ignored at great cost. Crews that failed to respond carefully disappeared, or worse, remained inside the station in forms unrecognizable, twisted, pressed against the glass as the ocean learned to manipulate them. Lewis's disappearance, the voices in the vents, the shadow shapes, they all traced back to this. Never ignore unusual pressure readings. I spent the next cycle patrolling the corridors, checking each panel, adjusting readings minute by minute. Sweat dripped from my brow onto the console, careful to avoid Rule 4. The shadows hovered just beyond the floodlights, gliding closer when I hesitated. I could feel their awareness, the intelligent patience in their movement. They were waiting for any lapse in my attention, any failure to respond properly. Hull pressure wasn't a technicality, it was the boundary separating life from death, sanity from the abyss. One error, and the station itself would be transformed into a tomb. By the evening, I had developed a routine: monitor, adjust, verify, repeat. Every alarm, every spike, every shadow was accounted for. The pressure readings became an extension of my senses, the only tangible proof that I could control something in the station, however small. I slept sitting upright, lights steady, gloves dry, every sensor cross-checked. The shadows pressed, but I maintained the equilibrium. Ignoring the rule wasn't an option. I had learned the hard way. Even a single overlooked fluctuation could allow the ocean's intelligence inside, and once inside, nothing would stop it. Even now, weeks later, I still watch the monitors obsessively. Every subtle movement, every minor deviation, every fluctuation in hull pressure commands immediate attention. The shadows glide beyond the glass with uncanny intelligence, mimicking movements, testing responses, probing for mistakes. Rule 6 is clear: never ignore unusual pressure readings. They are the first warning of the ocean's awareness, the first signal that whatever waits beyond the hull is learning, observing, and waiting for its chance. I had stared at that hatch countless times, the thick metal circle at the center of the observation deck, its bolts gleaming faintly under the emergency lights. It had always seemed innocuous, a simple door to the outside, a necessary exit in extreme emergencies. But now, after weeks of watching shadows glide just beyond the glass, and feeling the station respond to my every move, I remembered Rule 7, never open the observation dome hatch, unless absolutely necessary. That rule had seemed minor, a precautionary step against water flooding or decompression accidents. But now it carried a weight I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the pressure, the risk of leakage, or the mechanics. It was the shadows. They would notice. They would respond. Earlier that morning, I had walked along the deck, inspecting the glass for microfractures, small imperfections caused by the constant pressure fluctuations. Each time I glanced at the shadowy shapes pressing against the other side, I felt an instinctive urge to open the hatch, to see if I could lure them away or confront them somehow. My mind screamed at me, a low, insistent warning. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were written by people who had seen the consequences of breaking them. I leaned back from the hatch, palms pressed against the reinforced metal, fingers trembling despite the gloves. One slip, one instinctual reach, and I could invite the horrors inside. By afternoon, the shadow beyond the glass had changed again. It was larger now, more defined, moving with a rhythm that mimicked my own. It lingered just at the edge of the floodlight, swaying slowly as if marking territory, testing my reactions. Every time I moved closer to the hatch, it mirrored me almost perfectly, a second version of myself pressing against the ocean. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, adrenaline coursing through every nerve. I reminded myself silently, do not open the hatch. The rule existed for a reason, and violating it would remove every thin barrier keeping me safe. The next spike in pressure readings coincided with a faint creak in the metal surrounding the dome. The station had never made that sound before, and I froze, gloves gripping the console tightly. I had to check it, to make sure nothing was failing mechanically, but I knew that touching or manipulating the hatch, even slightly, could trigger a response. My stomach twisted as I scanned the external monitors. The shadow was closer than ever, its elongated limbs stretching in the dim light, tracing the contours of the glass with unnatural precision. Panic threatened to override rational thought, but the rule anchored me. No matter the temptation, the hatch stayed closed. I spent hours monitoring the readings, carefully adjusting internal systems to reduce stress on the hatch and the surrounding hull. The shadows didn't retreat. Instead, they seemed to study me, hovering in place, waiting for a lapse. The realization struck me. These entities weren't random. They had awareness, patience, and intelligence. Every previous rule, every lesson learned from moisture, pressure, and light, culminated in this. Opening the hatch without absolute necessity would be catastrophic. My mind conjured impossible scenarios of what might happen. A tidal surge of the ocean flooding the deck, a shadow slipping inside, or even my own reflection becoming the predator. Night fell, and the emergency lights glowed steadily, the dim amber illuminating the deck. I tried to sleep sitting upright, but I could feel the pressure outside, subtle vibrations along the hull, as if the ocean itself were brushing against the station with intent. The shadow moved in rhythm with my body, mirroring my posture, swaying as if keeping time with my breathing. Every instinct screamed to lock the hatch, to remain perfectly still, to avoid drawing attention. I knew now that Rule 7 wasn't just precaution, it was survival. A single act of curiosity could destroy me. The first real test came unexpectedly. A minor system failure triggered a warning on the external monitors, showing a tiny fissure near the hatch. I wanted to open it, to see what was causing the anomaly, but the shadows had drifted closer, and the flicker of fear made my fingers freeze over the emergency override panel. The hatch groaned faintly under the external pressure, and I realized the ocean could apply force through the hull. The station wasn't just a vessel, it was a barrier, and opening the hatch even slightly would compromise everything. The rule echoed in my mind louder than ever: never open the observation dome hatch, unless absolutely necessary. Hours passed with no further anomalies, but the shadows didn't leave. They hovered just beyond the glass, motionless yet oppressive, as if time itself had slowed for them. I tried speaking into the empty space, testing if they reacted to sound. They did, slowly tilting their heads, moving in perfect synchronization with me, but never advancing closer. My fear solidified into resolve. I would never touch the hatch, never test the rule, no matter how desperate I felt. I had seen the consequences of ignoring warnings, felt the intelligence of the ocean pressing against the station, and understood that survival demanded absolute compliance. By morning, I was exhausted. My eyes burned from hours of watching monitors, my hands stiff from tension, but I kept the lights on and my gloves dry. The hatch remained closed, bolts secure, every precaution followed to the letter. The shadow continued its vigil, looming just beyond the floodlights, mimicking my movements with eerie accuracy. I realized then that this wasn't just about obedience, it was a strategy. The shadows responded to every action, every deviation from the rules, and the hatch was the most vulnerable point of all. One breach, and they would enter. One lapse, and everything I had fought to maintain would collapse. Later that day, a new anomaly appeared, faint water droplets trailing down the viewport, forming a thin mist that distorted the light. My heart raced as I saw the shadow press closer, its elongated limbs stretched impossibly, fingers trailing along the condensation. I stepped back, palms away from the hatch, reminding myself silently of Rule 7. Every fiber of my being screamed to reach for the emergency override, to open the hatch and confront the threat, but I didn't. The rule existed for a reason. I watched the shadow, feeling the pressure, hearing the subtle vibration of the hull, and forced myself to remain still. Night fell again, and the shadows multiplied, forming shapes that had no right to exist in the depths. They leaned against the glass, pressed in impossible angles, always observing, always patient. I slept upright, emergency lights glowing, gloves layered, eyes half open to maintain vigilance. The hatch remained closed, and despite the growing pressure, I resisted the temptation to test the rule. It was no longer a suggestion. It was the difference between life and death. Every instinct screamed to act, to open, to see, but the shadows waited for that mistake. The rule's importance became undeniable. When I checked the sensors later that night, small fissures formed near the hatch, microscopic at first, almost invisible. The shadows seemed to pulse in reaction to the readings, testing the integrity, gauging my response. I adjusted internal systems carefully, monitoring every vibration and pressure change. The hatch remained firmly closed. The shadows mirrored my actions, learning from every correction. It became clear that Rule 7 wasn't just about sealing metal, it was about denying them access, maintaining the final barrier between the abyss outside and the fragile sanctuary of the station. By dawn, I realized the true weight of Rule 7. It demanded constant vigilance, precise observation, and unwavering discipline. It wasn't merely a guideline, it was survival. Opening the hatch for curiosity, for investigation, or for fear could invite the shadows inside. It could undo everything I had fought to maintain. The ocean outside wasn't just water, it was alive, intelligent, patient, and infinitely dangerous. The observation dome hatch was the final line, the fragile boundary separating me from the unknown, and breaking the rule meant giving the abyss permission to enter. The first time I heard it, I almost forgot the rule. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed through the hull, soft at first, barely perceptible over the constant hum of the generators. My heart skipped. Rule 8. Never follow sounds coming from outside the station raced through my mind, a warning I couldn't afford to ignore. I told myself it was mechanical, pipes settling, the ocean shifting. But instinctively, I moved toward the source, drawn by a need I couldn't articulate. The taps grew louder, clearer, forming patterns that seemed deliberate, almost like a language made of rhythm. I stopped, gripping the console, knowing that curiosity could be fatal. Weeks of isolation had warped my perception. Every creak, drip, or subtle vibration set my nerves on edge, and I had learned to differentiate between normal system noises and anomalies. This tapping wasn't normal. It pulsed through the hull in uneven intervals, low and deliberate, and it didn't match the ocean currents or pressure fluctuations I had been tracking. It was intelligent. My pulse pounded as I edged closer to the observation deck, every instinct screaming to step back, but the sound was intoxicating. A voice without words, calling me outward. The shadow beyond the glass shifted slightly, almost as if responding to the rhythm of the taps, mirroring their cadence in its swaying movement. I forced myself to remember the rule. The voice in the water, the shadows, the mimicry, they all played on instincts, luring anyone who would listen. The tapping stopped abruptly as I hesitated, leaving a suffocating silence in its place. I realized then that ignoring this rule even once could have consequences beyond imagination. The ocean wasn't just water, it was a predator that used curiosity as bait. One wrong move, one instinctive step toward the sound, and it could manipulate the station, the hull, and even my own perception, to draw me outside where I had no control. Later that night, the sound returned, this time accompanied by a faint ripple in the water along the observation dome. I froze, gloves tightening over the console edge. My mind raced with possibilities. Mechanical fault, external pressure, an actual life form, or worse, some intelligence beyond human comprehension. I forced myself to step back, eyes on the monitors, resisting the urge to investigate. The shadow mirrored my hesitation, gliding closer to the dome in slow, deliberate arcs, almost taunting me. I realized the sound wasn't just auditory, it was psychological, testing my obedience, my self-control, my willingness to survive. The hours stretched into days. Every attempt to rest was haunted by imagined taps, subtle drumming against the hull that I couldn't confirm with instruments. I became hyper-aware, every vibration analyzed, every anomaly recorded. I noticed a pattern. The tapping corresponded with spikes in pressure, subtle shifts in the water beyond the floodlights, and occasional flickers in the emergency lighting. The ocean, or whatever intelligence inhabited it, was orchestrating a symphony, each component meant to lure me into a fatal mistake. Following a sound wasn't just dangerous, it was giving it permission to manipulate me, to learn my habits, and to anticipate my movements. One night, the tapping became insistent, almost urgent. I could feel the vibrations through the floor panels, up my legs and into my chest. It wasn't just outside the station, it seemed to resonate through the very structure, as though the metal itself were speaking. I fought the urge to approach the observation deck, to trace the rhythm, to uncover the source. The shadow beyond the glass shifted in perfect synchronization, arms reaching unnaturally, mimicking my own desire to move closer. I clamped my hands to the console, forcing myself to remain still. Following the sound would break Rule 8, and I understood, with visceral certainty, that breaking the rule could cost me everything. Exhaustion blurred the lines between reality and hallucination. Sometimes I thought I heard multiple rhythms, overlapping, conflicting, each trying to pull me in different directions. My sleep was broken, my senses heightened to a painful degree. Every breath, every flicker of light, every minor vibration became a potential lure. The ocean outside wasn't passive, it anticipated my reactions, exploiting weaknesses, and the sounds were its weapon. The shadows leaned closer to the glass, moving in ways no natural creature could, extending limbs impossibly long, mimicking the contours of the observation dome. I had no doubt they were learning my patterns, testing my resolve, preparing for the moment I might fail. One morning, the tap stopped abruptly. I strained, ears pressed against the console, but the silence was worse. The absence of sound made the station feel heavier, the air thicker, the shadows more pronounced. I knew better than to move toward the dome, yet every instinct screamed that I should investigate. The rule had never been clearer. Following the sound was a trap, a calculated snare designed to draw me into a fatal encounter with the ocean's intelligence. I stayed put, documenting the anomaly, recording the empty monitors, and monitoring the pressure readings meticulously. Obedience was survival. Later that afternoon, a minor tremor shook the station. It wasn't strong, but it resonated through the hull in a way that triggered the monitors to register subtle but unusual pressure changes. I froze, thinking about the tapping and the shadows, the previous near misses, and the relentless intelligence of the ocean. Following a sound wasn't just auditory, it could affect the hull, disrupt systems, even manipulate perceptions. I double-checked all readings, secured the emergency lights, kept gloves dry, and resisted every instinct to move toward the observation deck. I reminded myself silently, never follow sounds coming from outside the station. The ocean seemed to understand my discipline. The shadow lingered, stretching its limbs against the glass, observing my every action without aggression. The tapping had ceased, but the presence remained, patient and intelligent, waiting for the tiniest lapse. I realized the rule's purpose. It wasn't just a warning, but a mechanism for survival. The ocean used curiosity as bait, manipulating every sense, every instinct. Obedience meant safety, disobedience meant annihilation. The sound was a tool, and the shadow its agent, testing my resolve in ways I could not yet comprehend. By nightfall, I had developed a rigorous routine. I monitored external vibrations, water currents, hull pressures, and even the faintest ambient noises. Each anomaly was logged and analyzed without approaching the source. The emergency lights glowed steadily, the gloves remained dry, and the hatch stayed closed. Every rule I had followed up to this point converged here. Rule 8 demanded unwavering restraint, a constant battle against instinct, against fear, against the lure of the unknown. The ocean waited, the shadow waited, but I did not move. Survival depended on listening, not following. Even now, the faint memory of those sounds haunts me. I hear them in my sleep, in the hum of the generators, in the occasional drip of condensation along the panels. They are everywhere and nowhere, testing me, ensuring that I remember never follow sounds coming from outside the station. Curiosity kills in the deep, and the ocean is patient enough to wait for the exact moment you slip. Every shadow beyond the glass, every tremor, every rhythm is a calculated temptation, and one lapse could undo everything I've fought to survive. I had stared at the observation dome countless times, watching shadows glide just beyond the glass. But it wasn't until the third week that I realized reflections could be deadly. Rule 9, never ignore reflections in the glass, had seemed trivial at first, a guideline for optics or glare, but now it carried a weight I could no longer dismiss. The water outside pressed against the dome, and the low glow of the emergency lights created distorted, flickering reflections that sometimes moved independently of my own. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks, fatigue amplifying every shadow, every ripple, but the signs were unmistakable. The reflections were alive, intelligent, and patient. It began subtly. A corner of the viewport would show a shape that wasn't mine, elongated, pale, and shifting as though breathing. At first, I looked away, telling myself it was condensation or an optical illusion, but the shapes didn't vanish. They lingered, faintly, almost imperceptibly mimicking my posture, then doing something slightly different. One evening, I caught a movement in the reflection that didn't correspond to the floodlights or the shadows outside. My pulse raced. I realized then that Rule 9 wasn't about optics. It was a warning against acknowledging the impossible, against allowing the ocean's intelligence to reach inside through the mirror of glass. The first real encounter came while I was recalibrating the internal sensors. I leaned close to the viewport, adjusting a panel, and noticed movement in the reflection just behind me, movement I hadn't made. A hand, pale and impossibly long, seemed to stretch toward me. I spun, gloves gripping the console, but the space behind me was empty. I understood instantly. The reflection had been separate, independent, a phantom version of reality. My heart pounded, every instinct screaming to look away, but curiosity gnawed at me. I remembered the rule, never ignore reflections. Obedience was no longer optional, it was survival. After that night, I became obsessive. Every reflection was monitored, every flicker analyzed. The shadows outside seemed to influence the glass, shaping reflections to manipulate perception. I saw shapes behind me when none existed, figures at angles impossible for the station's interior. Even my own reflection would occasionally lag, mimicking movements with a half-second delay. testing my reactions, testing my vigilance. The emergency lights, the hatch, the gloves, all precautions I had followed for other rules, did nothing against the reflections if I allowed myself to see too much. The reflections were intelligence made manifest in the glass. By the 5th day after the first encounter, I began documenting everything obsessively. Tiny cameras, internal monitors, even the periphery of my vision were recorded. Every shift in reflection, every impossible distortion, was noted. The shadows seemed aware of my recording. When I checked the playback, anomalies appeared where none had been recorded in real time. Shapes elongated, limbs bent at impossible angles, and the reflections seemed to reach out from the glass toward the station interior. I shivered, realizing Rule 9 wasn't just protective. It was a line between life and death, between awareness and being consumed. The pressure outside had intensified alongside the reflections. I could feel them pressing against the hull as I worked, watching, learning. Every attempt to adjust the internal systems was mirrored in the glass in ways I hadn't done. The reflections weren't passive. They anticipated, they responded, they adapted. One night, I saw my own image lift a tool I hadn't picked up yet, almost seconds before my hand reached for it. I froze, gloves tight on the console, realizing that the reflections could manipulate perception, that the ocean's intelligence could invade through visual deception alone. The following hours were torture. I avoided mirrors, any reflective surface, even my own device's screens. The shadows outside seemed to flourish with my compliance, testing boundaries, stretching along the glass, pressing hands to the surface, eyes glinting in the emergency light. I knew if I ignored a single reflection, allowed myself to stare too long, I could lose control, and whatever existed beyond the hull could exploit my inattention to invade the station. Fatigue made the reflections more convincing, more aggressive, forcing vigilance to the edge of human endurance. One incident nearly broke me. While adjusting a pressure valve near the observation deck, I caught movement in a peripheral reflection, a figure standing behind me. I whipped around. Nothing. Heart racing, sweat running beneath my gloves, I forced myself to look back at the reflection. The figure remained, smiling impossibly, fingers curling toward me. I backed away from the glass, reminding myself of Rule 9. Never ignore reflections. The warning was clear now. The reflections were predators, and the glass was the only barrier. Obedience was survival, and I had learned that the smallest lapse could be fatal. The psychological toll was relentless. Even when I closed my eyes briefly, I saw movement in the darkness, shapes pressed against the glass, mirrored in flashes behind my eyelids. The shadows had begun using reflections to reach inside my mind, bending reality to blur the line between what was outside and what was real. I could feel the intelligence of the ocean probing, pressing, learning. It wasn't just waiting, it was experimenting, exploiting curiosity and weakness. Any momentary glance at a reflection could provide it an opening. I began to design my movements meticulously. Every glance toward the glass was deliberate, measured, quick. I avoided unnecessary exposure to reflective surfaces, rearranged equipment to reduce visual cues, and relied on instruments to verify positions instead of my eyes. The shadows outside adapted, altering their shapes, elongating, flattening, stretching along the angles of the emergency light. I realized Rule 9 wasn't just about observation, it was about denying the intelligence in the water any control, any opportunity, any foothold into the station. By dawn I was exhausted, sleep deprived, every nerve taut with vigilance. The reflections had begun to fade slightly with consistent obedience, but the ocean waited, patient, probing for weaknesses, testing endurance. I understood now that Rule 9 was cumulative. Every reflection ignored, every visual temptation resisted, reinforced my survival. Every lapse was fatal. And even now, weeks later, I remain obsessed, tracking every movement, monitoring every shift in light and glass, knowing that ignoring the reflections could undo everything I've survived. Even as I write this log, the reflections linger, subtle, persistent, almost imperceptible. They move when I'm not looking, mirror what I do, distort what should be static. The rule is clear and non-negotiable: never ignore reflections in the glass. The moment I falter, they reach out, and the abyss presses a little closer. It started with a whisper, soft and indistinct, slipping through the vents and hull seams, as if carried by the water itself. I froze instantly, my mind screaming reminders of all the previous rules, but above all, Rule 10. Never communicate with unknown voices from the ocean, echoed sharply, a lifeline of clarity in the panic that gripped me. The voice called my name, elongated, warped, impossibly human yet alien, teasing me from beyond the glass. My pulse thundered, and I pressed my gloved hands against the console, reminding myself that responding, even mentally, could invite disaster. Curiosity burned, but experience screamed restraint. The first incident had occurred just after Rule 9. I had been reviewing reflections on the monitors, exhausted, eyelids heavy, when the whisper seeped through, soft as the movement of currents against the station. Basmeen, it hissed, elongated, curling around my thoughts like a living thing. I froze, gloves tight on the panel, and reminded myself of the rule. I didn't respond, didn't even glance toward the viewport. The shadows outside swayed slightly, synchronized to the cadence of the voice, testing me, gauging my obedience. I realized instantly that the voice wasn't merely sound. It was a tool, an extension of intelligence from the abyss, designed to manipulate and exploit the weaknesses of the living. Every attempt to ignore it became a test of endurance. The voice whispered again that night, calling my name, mocking my solitude, weaving phrases into fragments of memory, bending reality. At one point, I could swear it was inside the station, speaking from the floor panels, coaxing me to step closer to the observation dome. My muscles tensed, every fiber of my body screaming to flee, but I stayed still, following Rule 10. Responding would have been fatal, giving the ocean's intelligence an entry point into the station and into my mind. I clenched my jaw, kept my gloves dry, and stared at the monitors, forcing logic and reason to dominate instinct and terror. The whispers became patterns. They repeated, varied, changed timbre and tone, and at times mimicked past conversations of previous crew members. "Lewis, why did you leave me?" one whispered. Another hissed, "You can trust us." I could feel my resolve faltering, every instinct urging me to answer, to speak, to reach for a connection, but the rule was unambiguous. Communication was a bridge I could not cross. I recorded the audio, traced the frequencies, and checked the hull pressures, but no physical source existed. The station itself seemed to amplify the whispers, creating a sense of omnipresence, a feeling that the voices were everywhere at once, observing, judging, waiting. Weeks passed, and the voices grew bolder. They spoke in rhythms, sometimes in sync with reflections in the glass, sometimes with pressure spikes in the hull. I realized they were intelligent, aware, learning from my reactions. Each whisper I resisted, each urge I suppressed, felt like a battle between sanity and the ocean's will. One lapse, one syllable spoken, one inadvertent hum in response, could provide the intelligence beyond the water and opening. I slept sitting upright, emergency lights steady, gloves dry, and reinforced my mantra silently. Do not communicate, do not respond, do not engage. Rule 10 was the barrier between me and the abyss itself. During one long night, I made a critical mistake. Exhaustion clouded my mind, and a soft melodic whisper said, "Help us, open the hatch." My fingers twitched toward the console, almost pressing buttons that would have triggered safety overrides. I caught myself mid-motion, adrenaline spiking, muscles tense, and forced my hands back. The shadow beyond the glass shivered, elongated slightly, almost in triumph, as if aware of the temptation I had almost succumbed to. The voice receded, leaving a chilling silence in its wake. I understood then that even hesitation could be dangerous. The ocean exploited instinct, not just outright disobedience. I devised protocols to maintain isolation from the whispers. I restricted audio channels, sealed vents where subtle resonance carried sound, and monitored the hull for vibrations that might propagate the voices. Despite these measures, the whispers persisted, sometimes from directions that made no sense, as if the ocean itself had infiltrated perception. The shadows mirrored every move, swaying in sync with the cadence of the voices. Teaching, testing, learning. Rule 10 demanded more than obedience. It demanded near superhuman self-control under extreme psychological pressure. One morning, I noticed a change. The voices had shifted from mimicry to command, guiding me towards certain actions without speaking directly. My heart raced as I realized the subtlety of the manipulation. A soft hum, a vibration, a sequence of pressure fluctuations, all orchestrated to guide my decisions. Following these cues would be breaking Rule 10 without a single word being exchanged. I reinforced my vigilance, cross-checking every anomaly, monitoring every reflection, and reminding myself that any response could be my last. The ocean's intelligence didn't need speech. It could manipulate perception directly. By the 5th day, I had developed a strict regimen: monitor, verify, document, and ignore. I avoided unnecessary movements, kept my eyes on the monitors, stayed seated upright in my chair, with gloves dry, and repeated the mantra silently whenever the whispers returned. Do not respond, do not communicate, do not engage. Each syllable burned into my memory, a lifeline against the abyss. The shadows outside, the reflections in the glass, the subtle manipulations, all aligned with the whispers to test compliance. Any failure could trigger catastrophe. Obedience was survival, disobedience was annihilation. The psychological toll became unbearable. I could feel my thoughts bending toward the whispers, memories distorting, hallucinations blending with reality. Sometimes I thought I answered them in my mind, imagined conversations with Lewis or other missing crew members. But every time I realized the deception, I reinforced the rule. Rule 10 wasn't a guideline, it was a shield, a barrier, a line separating me from being consumed by the ocean's intelligence. Every whispered command resisted was a battle I could not afford to lose. By nightfall, the whispers began to fade, leaving only the shadows and the reflections in the dim amber light. I breathed heavily, palms pressed against the console, every nerve raw. The station felt heavier, denser, as if the ocean itself were watching my adherence to Rule 10. I understood now that survival was a series of choices: compliance with the rules, suppression of instinct, and unwavering attention to every anomaly. The whispers were patient. They would return. They would test me again. But for now, I had maintained the barrier. Even as I logged this entry, I can hear faint echoes through the ventilation, subtle and almost imperceptible. The shadows sway, reflections flicker, and the memory of the whispers lingers. The ocean waits, intelligent and patient, but I do not respond. I cannot respond. Rule 10 is clear: never communicate with unknown voices from the ocean. The moment I break this rule, even mentally, I give them access, and survival will no longer be possible. By the time the 11th week had settled over the station, I had learned that the interior corridors were my sanctuary, the one place where I could enforce all previous rules simultaneously. Rule 11: never leave the safety of the interior corridors alone had seemed almost obvious when the station was first constructed. Yet now, it carried the gravitas of every prior horror I had endured. The hallways were narrow, reinforced, and shielded from the subtle influence of the shadows, the whispers, the reflections. Outside, the ocean pressed against the hull with intelligence, patience, and an insidious, deliberate awareness that made every movement inside the station critical. Venturing into the open observation deck, or isolated rooms, was an invitation, a gamble I could not afford. Earlier that morning, I had to retrieve vital readings from the generator room, located at the far end of the east corridor. Each step along the narrow hallway echoed faintly, and though the corridors were supposedly sealed, I could sense the subtle pressure changes, the vibrations, almost imperceptible, that indicated the shadow's presence outside. I kept gloved hands firmly on the console panels that lined the walls, monitoring every movement, every spike in hull pressure. The ocean had learned my patterns, my rhythm, and it had adapted. Every footstep outside the corridor would be mimicked, amplified, manipulated, drawing attention to the most isolated places of the station. Rule 11 wasn't precaution, it was the difference between life and death. Halfway down the east corridor, the lights flickered briefly, a minor electrical hiccup I should have anticipated. My heart jumped anyway, adrenaline spiking, fingers tightening around the panel rails. For a moment, I imagined leaving the corridor, stepping into the observation deck, just to see what had caused the flicker. I stopped instantly. Rule 11 echoed in my mind: never leave the interior corridors alone. Experience had taught me that even a fleeting lapse could be fatal. The shadows would not hesitate. The whispers would not plead. They would exploit weakness, and the abyss would fill the vacuum created by disobedience. As I approached the generator room, I noticed a faint ripple along the reinforced window beside the corridor. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet it set every nerve on edge. The shadows outside mirrored my approach, elongating along the glass, swaying with deliberate intelligence. My gloves were already damp from tension, every muscle coiled tight. I realized that being alone, even in the corridor, meant vigilance was mandatory. One mistake, one stray glance, one deviation from the corridor's safety, and the station would become a hunting ground. Obedience was survival, and the ocean tested me with every subtle ripple, every flicker, every echo. Inside the generator room, I worked quickly, recalibrating the main systems, monitoring the hull pressure, checking the airflow. The corridors had become a shield against both physical and psychological threats. I could control my exposure, limit sensory manipulation, and enforce every previous rule from within these narrow walls. Yet I knew the shadows were patient. They studied the glass, the reflections, the vibrations. They waited for the moment I might stray, testing my willpower, measuring my endurance, probing for a lapse. Rule 11 was the culmination of all the lessons I had learned. Movement alone outside the corridors was an invitation to the abyss. Hours passed, with only minor fluctuations. I returned to the east corridor after a brief break, feeling the exhaustion pressing on my mind and body. The station's hum, the gentle vibration of the ocean, the subtle sway of shadows against the glass, all reminded me that I was never truly alone. The corridors offered protection, yes, but vigilance was my constant companion. I monitored every anomaly, every reflection, every whisper that tried to draw me toward the observation deck or the outer rooms. Even a single misstep outside these corridors could compromise the fragile equilibrium I had fought so hard to maintain. Night fell, and the shadows became more active, swaying in patterns that no natural current could produce. I moved along the corridor deliberately, gloves gripping rails, eyes fixed on the monitors. At one point, I caught movement, just beyond the viewport, a hand, elongated, stretching impossibly, pausing as though testing me. The rule echoed in my mind like a mantra: never leave the safety of the interior corridors alone. Panic threatened to overtake reason, but experience had taught me that obedience wasn't just caution, it was survival, the only factor separating me from the intelligence pressing against the glass. A subtle tremor shook the station, faint but enough to make the corridor sway slightly beneath my feet. My pulse surged, every instinct screaming to move toward the observation deck, to check for damage, to confront whatever lurked beyond the hull. I stopped instantly, pressed myself against the wall, and reinforced my grip on the rails. Rule 11 had never felt so critical. Even the whispers seemed to respond to my hesitation, intensifying, stretching into my thoughts, trying to lure me from the corridor's protection. I did not move. I could not move. Survival demanded compliance, and I remembered every lesson from the previous rules. By morning, the station was quiet, yet I remained alert. I patrolled the corridors meticulously, checking panels, reviewing pressure readings, monitoring reflections. The shadows outside swayed with patience, testing boundaries without aggression, waiting for fatigue or curiosity to break me. Every previous rule converged in the corridors: pressure readings, reflections, whispers, the hatch, the sounds. They all became manageable only within the narrow confines of these protective halls. Leaving them, even momentarily, would remove all control, and the abyss would immediately fill the vacuum. Late that night, fatigue threatened to override vigilance. My muscles ached, my mind was foggy, yet I reminded myself. Rule 11. I visualized every corridor as a barrier, every wall as a shield, every step as a ritual of survival. The shadows outside mimicked every movement, swaying in sync, testing my awareness, testing my resolve. I realized then that the rule was not just physical, it was psychological, an anchor against the manipulations of the ocean's intelligence, a boundary keeping me alive. Compliance wasn't optional, it was mandatory. By the 11th week's end, I had developed a rigid routine. I moved only within the corridors, never venturing into the observation deck alone, never leaving the interior rooms unmonitored. Every fluctuation, every anomaly, every whisper, every shadow was catalogued, tracked, and resisted. The ocean waited patiently, but the corridors offered a fragile, disciplined protection. Rule 11 had become more than instruction. It was the culmination of every prior rule, the final barrier against the abyss that pressed with relentless intelligence beyond the glass. Even now, weeks later, I patrol the corridors tirelessly, monitoring the shadows, the reflections, the hull, the whispers, and every subtle vibration. The ocean outside waits, patient and intelligent, but I remain vigilant. Rule 11 is the difference between survival and annihilation. Leaving the corridors is unthinkable, impossible. The abyss presses closer with every lapse in obedience, yet within these narrow halls, I maintain control, focus, and for now, life. The station hums quietly, lights steady, gloves dry, monitors flashing in rhythm with the hull's subtle vibrations. I cannot leave. I will not leave. The shadows sway, the whispers linger, and reflections distort subtly along the glass, all waiting for the first misstep. Rule 11 is the final line, the ultimate protection, and I cling to it, as I have clung to all the rules. Outside, the ocean waits, patient, intelligent, and infinitely aware. One lapse, one single moment of weakness, and it will be too late. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.